Chapter 10 Madison Square Garden. One evening in Sydney, my wife and I had Jim over for dinner, and before he left, he asked if he could talk a little business. He told me he was considering bringing Ivan Koloff to Australia and asked if I would fly to New York City and watch Ivan in person to see if he would work out and fit in Australia. While I wasn't on Jim's level, I had a good eye and knew how to spot talent, and Jim trusted my judgment. And even though Vince McMahon had assured Jim that Ivan was great, Jim was depending on me for the truth, because even if promoters were good friends, which Jim and Vince most definitely were, if they had a piece of talent that they wanted to get rid of, they would hype him up to no end. I was more than happy to take on this assignment from Jim, and knowing Vince's penchant for big muscle heads, Jim's last words to me were, "I don't want you bringing me back a crusher, Verdu." I went to New York City for the January 19, 1970 card at Madison Square Garden as a representative of Jim Barnett's office. It was the first and only time I've ever been in New York City, and it was an all-expenses-paid trip. Jim Barnett paid the airfare, hotel, food, taxis, everything. The WWWF staff knew I was coming to look at talent, and during the day of the show I met with Vince McMahon, Arnold Skaaland, and Angelo Savoldi in their second-floor office at the Holland Hotel on 42nd Street in Manhattan. We had a very nice time, and I remember being impressed by how genuinely kind Vince McMahon was. That evening at the Garden, I noticed that there were a lot of old-time wrestlers visiting backstage, and was surprised to see Vince go up to each and every one of them and give them a payoff. He even gave me a payoff of $250 that night, and I was just their scouting talent. Vince was a great man, and even though he was clearly the king of New York, he treated me like royalty that night. I saw a lot of familiar faces in the Garden dressing room, such as Waldo von Erich, Mario Milano, and Bob Ellis, and met a lot of new ones, as well. There was a young wrestler hanging out in the dressing room that night, though he wasn't wrestling, named Dupo Mongol. He would later change his ring name to Nikolai Volkov. I also met Gorilla Monsoon for the first time that evening. He was a big, rugged guy, but at the same time, he was a complete gentleman. That's also where I first met Buddy Roberts. He was there hanging out with Ivan Koloff, because they were really good friends. Bruno Sammartino was headlining that night. I hadn't seen Bruno since Detroit, so I went to him and said hello, but he was very cold to me. He never stood up, but instead just barely looked up, shook my hand, and muttered, "Hi. How are you?" I didn't think anything of it at the time, and figured he was just preparing for his match. Ivan Koloff, Gorilla Monsoon, Buddy Roberts, Arnold Skaaland, and I went out for dinner after the show to an Italian restaurant in Brooklyn, and then we went to this club in Manhattan where we drank, gambled, and played cards all night. I was extremely impressed with Ivan's in-ring performance, so I spent that time getting to know him better, and telling him what Australia was like. He was an incredibly nice guy, and very respectful. He told me that he really wanted to go to Australia, but he had just gotten married and wasn't comfortable leaving his new wife for a few months. I got back to the hotel in the early hours of the morning and called Jim in Sydney with my report. I told him, "I watched Ivan work, and the guy impressed the hell out of me. I think he's a winner and worth every penny you'll spend on him. However, he just got married 2 months ago and is leery of leaving his wife." "Make a deal with him," Jim replied. "Offer him $1,000 a week, and tell him not to worry, I'll bring his wife, too." As I knew from experience, Jim wanted his wrestlers to be as comfortable as possible. If he was going to spend his time, money, and energy on someone, and was figuring them into his inner circle, he wanted to make sure they were happy, and kept happy. When I saw Ivan the next day and told him the deal Jim was offering him, he was tickled to death. Ivan was one of the highest priced guys that Jim ever brought to Australia, but in Australia,